Hello, I'm Jay Nicoll of Nicoll Investigations, and I'm here to tell you about our next episode of Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast. From this Sunday, March 24th, on the murder of Gail Ryan. Gail Ryan had just moved to Hamilton from her native New Brunswick. Another in a broken-hearted family back home, there is little known about her. September 25th, 1973, Ryan was last seen around 11 p.m. at her home after returning from a local bar with an unknown male. Unusual noises were heard coming from her apartment around 1 a.m., but no one called police. Ryan's lifeless body was found 2 days later when she didn't show up for work at department store G.W. Robinson's. Police say she was bludgeoned with a bottle and stabbed with a knife. It is believed this was a sexually motivated attack. The original $2,000 reward remains in effect. Please consider subscribing to Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast, on Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Hello, I'm Jay Nicoll from Nicoll Investigations, and this is an Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast, missing persons special on Dana Zelic of Hamilton, Ontario, dating back to 1999. Dana Zelic was born November 12, 1972 in Hamilton, Ontario, where she grew up with one younger brother. She attended Delta Secondary School on Main Street West and was described as a so-so student who enjoyed drama classes. After graduation, she took several years off to travel. For a while, she lived with a boyfriend. When the relationship ended, she moved into her mother's apartment in Hamilton's East End. At 26 years old, Dana enrolled in a tourism course at a vocational school downtown and planned to get a place of her own. On the evening of August 30, 1999, Dana was asleep at the apartment. Her mother saw her at 2:30 a.m. By morning, she had vanished. She left behind her identification, money, clothing, medication, and other personal belongings. Initially, her mother assumed she had stepped out and would return. Dana never came home. She was never seen or heard from by anyone in her family again. Dana was reported missing soon after she disappeared. Several weeks later, Dana's mother saw a photo of her in the Hamilton Spectator at a Take Back the Night march. The photo was taken on September 17, 1999, after Dana was reported missing. According to one source, Dana looked frail in the photo. 1 year later, in August of 2000, Dana called a male friend in Hamilton who did not know she was missing. Dana said she was living in Mississauga, about 48 kilometers away. No details about this call have been released. It's unknown where Dana was or who she was with when she placed the call. The last reported sighting of Dana was in 2002. One of her friends called police to report they had seen her at the Chapters bookstore in Hamilton. However, the Chapters in Hamilton and Upper Wentworth had closed in January of 2000. The only Chapters in the area at the time was located in Ancaster on Golf Links Road. It's possible the friend spotted Dana at this location. However, there is no available public information to substantiate these sightings. So where is Dana Zelic? It's been over 20 years since anyone was reported seeing or hearing from Dana Zelic. Dana is described as 5'6", 100 pounds, with brown eyes and dark brown hair. She has a birthmark on the left side of her throat, is known to wear baggy clothing, and has connections to the GTA in Brooklyn, New York. She also uses the names Frankie, Alex, and Donna. If Dana left with nothing, she must have had help. The circumstances of her disappearance are unknown, and her case is being investigated by the Hamilton Police Service Victims of Crime Unit. So please consider subscribing to Ontario Cold Cases, a podcast, on Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Hello, I'm Jay Nicoll from Nicoll Investigations, and I'm here to tell you about some of the upcoming episodes of Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast. Adele Komorowski was a 26-year-old McMaster University graduate student nearing the completion of her thesis. In 1972, she worked towards her master's in German languages and literature. It was a small department, about 10 graduate students, and fewer faculty. On Tuesday, May 15, 1973, with her 27th birthday in 2 weeks, she met a girlfriend for coffee. She was attractive and popular among staff and students. Felt safe on campus. One female student often slept overnight in her graduate office. Adele was at her desk on the 5th floor working on her thesis till about 11 p.m. Adele picked up her purse and umbrella. She left an unfinished message on the page. She walked into the darkness lit by a full moon to the end of her story. Adele was murdered in a ravine behind the campus. Among the suspects back then, the professor, the boyfriend, and the stranger. Please consider subscribing to Ontario Cold Cases, a podcast on Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Hello, I'm Jay Nicoll from Nicoll Investigations, and I'm here to tell you about some of the upcoming episodes of Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast. On July 2nd, 1987, well-known Canadian horse jockey Dan Beckon's dead body was found at a farm in Bolton, Ontario. The police ruled the matter as a suicide. The police investigation maintained that Beckon shot himself in the head with a Winchester .22 caliber rifle. The spent .22 caliber casing was measured meters away from the body. The investigative team reenacted the scene several times, both as a murder and a suicide. When reenacted as a suicide, the casings fell no further than 1 meter. However, when reenacted as a murder, the casings landed approximately the same distance as measured by police. The conclusion of the videotaped reenactment gave every indication that Beckon could not possibly have shot himself, as the casings were found too far from the body at the crime scene. So who shot Dan Beckon? Or was it really a suicide? Could it have been over drugs? Perhaps some fixed races? Find out in an upcoming episode of Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast. And please consider subscribing to Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast on Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Hello, I'm Jay Nicoll from Nicoll Investigations, and I'm here to tell you about some of the upcoming episodes of Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast. David Buller, a well-liked senior lecturer of visual arts who had taught at the University of Toronto for 15 years, was killed on January 18, 2001. His murder shocked the campus and the city in its brazenness. On that Thursday afternoon, Buller was in his office working on his computer on an art project when he was stabbed 7 times with a knife. A cleaning lady found his body just before 7 a.m. the next morning. Please consider subscribing to Ontario Cold Cases, a podcast on Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Hello, I'm Jay Nicoll from Nicoll Investigations. I'm here to tell you about some of the upcoming episodes of Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast. On March 25th, 1994, the charred body of 24-year-old Louisa da Cunha was found in a remote field in Caledon, north of Toronto. Cunha, who had lived on Queen Street West in the low-income Parkdale neighborhood of Toronto, was a marginal individual known to police as someone involved in illicit drug use. Please consider subscribing to Ontario Cold Cases, a podcast on Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Hello, I'm Jay Nicoll from Nicoll Investigations, and I'm here to tell you about some of the upcoming episodes of Ontario Cold Cases, the podcast. 35-year-old Trinidadian immigrant Hermal Ramnanan was found dead in a second-floor apartment on Avenue Road near Eglinton Avenue West on Saturday, August 7th, 1982. The man's new body was found by police after they were alerted by neighbors, disturbed by the man's stereo, which had been blaring all night. Ramnanan had been tied up and stabbed several times. Was Hermal an early victim of serial killer Bruce McArthur? Please consider subscribing to Ontario Cold Cases, a podcast on Patreon, Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts.